Make your way back to your seats, please, ladies and gentlemen, for the last lecture today, please. Make your way back to your seats if you'd be so kind. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you a man who really needs no introduction, but it's a man who, someone who I read his books when I was younger. I was very fascinated by this man's stories. I'd like to welcome with the story of the Highgate Vampire, the wonderful Mr. David Farrant. Thank you very much.
While we may dismiss them as myth, in reality werewolves and vampires are far from being just the imaginings of ancient history. Sightings continue well into the present, and the reports are far too numerous to dismiss. London's Highgate Cemetery is the centre of Britain's best documented contemporary vampire case. One account comes from David Farrant, who runs the British Psychic and Occult Society.
Reports were coming into the society in late 1969 about a tall, dark figure that had been sighted in and around Highgate Cemetery.
Farrant interviewed several eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the creature. One was an elderly lady who walked her dog past the cemetery's main gate every night.
As she passed the middle gate, the dog whined and it turned around and tried to drag her back down the lane. Then she looked up and she became aware of a tall figure with red eyes inside the main gate of Highgate Cemetery. And of course it petrified her and she couldn't leave quickly. Another person that I interviewed was a 40-year-old accountant whose name was Debunking. He said that all of a sudden he became aware he sensed something behind him, and he said that's what it was to me, that it seemed to be trying to drain him of energy. And all of a sudden, it just wasn't there.
As local residents became swept up in the hysteria, Farrant began searching the cemetery for hard evidence. Eventually he found himself face to face with the creature.
I suddenly became aware of something out the corner of my eye. And I looked up and I saw a tall, dark figure. It must have been around 8 feet tall. And I wasn't sure if it was or not. It was floating off the ground because the bottom of it just seemed to disappear into impenetrable blackness.
The air surrounding Farrant turned ice cold, and he felt himself transfixed by the creature.
I mentally repeated a Kabbalistic incantation which is used to repel evil forces. And all of a sudden it just wasn't there, and the temperature returned to normal.
Undeterred, Farrant returned to Highgate the next night to find and expel the vampire.
I was actually carrying a stake. It was a pointed stake, and it was engraved with magical symbols. I was also carrying a cross, but that ceremony, or that attempted ceremony, got interrupted by police. I was taken to court and charged with vampire hunting. Well, actually, that's not technically correct, because you can't be charged with vampire hunting. It's not illegal.
Farrant was formally charged with trespassing, and the cemetery was closed to the public. While he never encountered the vampire again, reports of strange dark figures haunting Highgate at night continue to this day.
That is the only time in my career that I can honestly say I've ever seen anything like that.
Modern reports of the undead are by no means restricted to the old world. Accounts come from across the Americas, including Texas, New Mexico, and of course, Louisiana.
That is actually what basically happened. I was arrested one night with other people in Highgate Cemetery, and we had gone there to conduct a psychic seance. A psychic seance meaning we had with us a psychic medium, and the idea was to communicate or attempt to communicate with whatever it was that was being reported at Highgate Cemetery. It was invariably described as a tall, dark figure, sometimes with glowing eyes, and it confronted people in and around Highgate Cemetery and in Swains Lane, which is a steep incline, steep hill, which divides Highgate Cemetery West, that's the old one, from the new Highgate Cemetery, the comparatively new Highgate Cemetery that was built in 1863, I think. But anyway, I was arrested, but I was acquitted of that charge back in 1970. And of course, I'm only going to tell you this really quickly because I don't want to go into it, it's too complicated. That's if you're even interested. The police set me up for that charge. It's true I had a stake, a pointed stake, and it's true I had a cross. But the purpose of those implements, incidentally we all had small Celtic crosses, the purpose of the stake was to inscribe a magical circle on the ground by using chalk or paint or whitewash or powder. It wasn't to stake a vampire with. But in court, actually let me go back, this was in 1970. Let me go back a little so it fits into place properly. In the late 1960s onwards, Highgate Cemetery had become besieged by vandals who were going in there and causing incredible damage. It was also used as a location by Hammer Horror Movies to make such films as Taste the Blood of Dracula, Dracula AD 72, Tales from the Crypt, The Body Beneath. They are endless. And it wasn't only Hammer Movies, it was other big film companies. The reason the cemetery was used, because it was very, very Gothic looking. And of course, people who saw these Dracula movies also saw Highgate Cemetery, or they saw the vaults and the Circle of Lebanon. And it was unmistakably Highgate Cemetery. But the ghost, the apparition, the entity, or whatever it was that had been sighted there, very quickly got turned into a blood-sucking vampire, thanks to these early horror movies. And it wasn't only the big film companies going in, there were groups of students. One, for example, I remember, and I can name him because it was on the front page of the local paper. His name was Barry Edwards. And he went on to the television after stories had appeared in the local Ham and High Express saying, I was the vampire. Because what happened was, the local papers and certain other people were turning this apparition into a vampire. And they were adding to this story by saying it slept in the catacombs of Highgate Cemetery, which encouraged vandals to go in there. And they're actually ripping open the old Victorian coffins and putting wooden stakes through the corpses in there, some of them being over 150 years old. So it was heavy-duty, serious vandalism, and the police weren't taking it seriously. At least until they caught hold of myself. And they decided that I'd make a good scapegoat, because I was well known in the area as being a mystic and a white witch, some papers referred to me as. And this was going on in Highgate Cemetery. Now, I went to court. I said this, I want to get to the end of this silly court business quite quickly. The police, bearing all this in mind, the vandalism, coffins being broken open, corpses being staked, attributed a statement to myself. It's called verbal evidence. I don't believe it's allowed nowadays. They have to have tape recorders, all witnesses and this sort of thing. I was taken to Highgate Police Station, and my camera, I had a small portable camera with me, and I also had a small portable tape recorder. I saw the items arranged on the desk in the police station, plus some candles and some incense, that sort of thing. But the police didn't produce those items as evidence. All they did was produce this stake, which was used, or was meant to be used, because the police interrupted it at the beginning, to cast a magical circle, protective circle. And a small cross I had with me for protection, as did the other people. And the statement, actually, it really amounts to a confession of guilt. My statement to the police was to the effect, I told them they wouldn't understand, and I'd gone into Highgate Cemetery to find and stake the Highgate Vampire. My intention was to find, this is me, according to the police, my intention was to seek out the King Vampire of the undead, stake it through the heart, and opening coffins if necessary, stake it through the heart, and afterwards I would have run away. What is that if it's not police language? Do you think anyone would be brave enough to go into Highgate Cemetery and actually do that, would just run away at the end of it? But that is what the police told the court I had said, which was not true. This statement wasn't signed by myself. It was never even shown to myself. Quite simply, I would never have signed it. I told the police it was part of a serious psychic investigation. That's why the other people were there. And the purpose of that ceremony was to communicate with the psychic entity that had been reported around Highgate Cemetery. I did not tell the police it was a vampire. The police were asking me questions about vampires because they'd already been on television. They'd already been in the local press, and they were saying to me things like, "You don't really believe in vampires?" And I told them, no, I don't. It's part of a serious psychic investigation. And we are just as entitled to conduct a psychic investigation as some people are to start an investigation into the Loch Ness Monster. I was acquitted, but the point is, this statement was read out in open court. And the stipendiary magistrate allowed it. And as the press were in court, they picked up the story and they loved it. And the headlines were, "Caught on the trail of the Highgate Vampire," and all this sort of nonsense. That's how I became branded as a vampire hunter, and I'm not a vampire hunter. I'm just a simple psychic investigator. On the subject of vampires, I better tell you all something right at the beginning so there's no misunderstanding. I do not even accept the existence of blood-sucking vampires. Ironically as it sounds, I do not think such creatures exist. Ghosts, unexplained entities, apparitions from the past, maybe. Yes, of course. That's the purpose of the society, is to look into all these cases. Vampires cannot exist. I'll tell you why they can't exist. when the body dies, and this obviously affects all of us, well, will do one day, we don't know what happens, but we do know that we contain a life force that gives us the power to move, think, and the brain doesn't actually think. What thinks is a power that operates on the brain. Why vampires can't exist? We do not know where consciousness goes when we die, pass over, whatever you want to call it. But we do know one thing, at least, that is that we are alive, that we are conscious. That is one thing we never really question. It's rather like, you know, I've given this example before, and it's not something that I've read in a book, it's just something that occurred to me. It's rather like a snake that casts in its skin. The snake, well, rather the skin, is on the ground, crumbles to bits and is blown away by the wind. But a new snake with a new skin emerges from the old skin. That's part of nature. But it's just as impossible as for vampires to exist, and I'm talking about the Hammer horror movie type vampires, as it would be for a snake that's cast its skin to go back and live in the old skin. The body, the physical body is dead. And so all this nonsense about vampires coming back to life or being undead, it just started with Bram Stoker, I'm afraid, and it was encouraged by Hammer movies. It turned the poor old Highgate ghost into a blood-sucking vampire. It turned me into a vampire hunter, which I never have been. You know, it's a strange thing, but people can generally not understand the psychic world. I don't claim to understand it, all of it. Far from it. I often say, I don't understand it. But one thing I am sure of, there are no things as blood-sucking vampires. As I said, I was acquitted of that court case back in 1970, I think it was September. And I was free to go. I was then approached by the BBC, and I think this is important. The pictures of me have been, at the time, were in the papers, holding a cross and a stake, with a story accompanying it saying I was in the cemetery to stake the vampire. What happened was the BBC contacted me, but because I'd been acquitted, and because Highgate Cemetery was open to the public in those days, they wanted to do a film in Highgate Cemetery on my court case, and for the purposes of this, they asked me to bring a stake and my stake and the cross. And I said, well, I can't bring the stake with me because the police have confiscated it. Of course, we had crosses, and that was easy. And they filmed me inside Highgate Cemetery, walking around, and the story was about the film which you saw there. And the BBC quite rightly pointed out to their audience that I was acquitted of that charge. And I was acquitted, But because of the way the police had treated me, I wasn't very pleased about that. And so I accepted the BBC's offer to meet them in Highgate Cemetery, and they obtained permission, obviously, from the cemetery authorities, and be filmed speaking about the... I didn't refer to it as a vampire, I referred to it as unexplained entity, apparition. I agreed to that. And the reason I point that out is because people were saying to me, you say you're not a vampire hunter, but what about all these pictures of you in old newspapers holding a stake and a cross with a story? Well, I've just explained it to you. That's how it came about. That's why the BBC wanted to illustrate that particular story, and they wanted to interview me, myself, because I've been acquitted of so-called hunting a vampire. Dan, I never wear a watch, so you'll have to sort of tell me where we are.
Yeah, cool, you got about sort of another half hour, so...
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, as long as you want, put it that way. So you started sort of 15 minutes late, so you do have another half an hour to finish about 6:15, so...
Oh dear.
Well, if you have questions, as obviously as well...
Yeah, I'll take any questions. I don't really know what's... I just mentioned Highgate Cemetery again, you know. That apparition which has been seen there is still being witnessed. And it's not only a visual figure which is witnessed sometimes by people. People have described oppressive atmosphere in there. Mobile phones inexplicably stopped working, all in the vicinity of the top gate of the cemetery where this apparition was sighted. And cameras wouldn't work. Inexplicably, for no reason. One reason might be because Highgate Cemetery is based on a ley line, and just for the sake of people here, I'm not going to go into ley lines, except just to say they are lines of energy which is unknown to science, which may be responsible in some way for conducting psychic energy from one place, from one location to another. There is a public house only yards from the back of Highgate Cemetery where this tall, dark figure has been witnessed on quite a few occasions. Glasses fall off shelves, taps turn themselves on and off, and often the staff in that pub, which is called the Flask incidentally, have described seeing a phantom figure, usually after hours when they've gone down to clear up downstairs, or usually when they were alone. And exactly the same thing was happening in the other location on this ley line. It was a pub called the Gatehouse. And again the same thing has happened. In 1967, yes, I think it was January, somebody in the pub described seeing a horrendous figure there. The landlord himself went upstairs one night to make sure all the lights were off, because they had a ballroom upstairs, and there was a main switch there. And he just turned off the main lights, and suddenly he saw a cowled figure, as he described it, gloating at him and coming towards him. Well, he was petrified. And in his rush to get away or get back downstairs, he actually fell down the stairs in the pub. And he was taken to the Whittington Hospital. And he was kept in for observation. Although apparently he discharged himself early next morning when he got over his fright. So there again is a tall dark figure in the flask, tall dark figure in the Gatehouse pub. Now on the third location of this ley line is a very old council estate. It's called Hillcrest. It's not that old, it was built after the war, I think in 1947. But the thing is, it was built on the grounds of a much earlier convent. The convent itself used to be a home for unmarried mothers. And let's remember, in Victorian times, ladies of the street, if you like, or girls or ladies that had babies out of wedlock, were frowned upon. And it was on those grounds that this convent was constructed. But again, in the grounds of Hillcrest, as it is now, a tall dark figure has been seen by children in the daytime, not necessarily at night. The kids playing on the estate, it was a common rumour there. So there is another example of another location on the line, the ley line, where this tall dark figure has been reported. All I did, and I actually put this in my book, or asked this in my book, could it be that the figure seen along different locations along the ley line was in fact the same ghostly figure that had been reported initially at Highgate Cemetery, and which certain people rather ridiculously try to turn into a vampire. So ley lines are an important factor. As I said, they're not actually recognised by science, but because they're not recognised by science doesn't mean to say they don't exist. There's a lot of things science cannot prove about life, about existence. I don't know if any of you here have heard of James Randi, the illusionist, the magician, and more than that, oh my God, what a skeptic. Do you know, I went on that site, and I'm talking about their website, and I was attacked. I don't mean physically, I'm talking about mentally or in writing. It was along the effect of that I was a psychic investigator. They wanted to know how I could prove. That was the key word, proof. Give us proof. And I said, well, I cannot, I never claimed to be able to give you proof. Give yourselves proof. Look at yourselves. realise that you're alive. There's your proof. You're alive. There's the miracle. And they come back and attack me, and I say, you cannot prove anything by scientific means. Life is invisible. You can't put life in a test tube. You cannot analyse it. Life, spirit, the thing that animates all of us, not only us, human beings, but all of nature. That life force gives everything life. The skeptics, I'm afraid to say, are not very understanding. And naturally, somebody like myself becomes their immediate sort of target for attack. I didn't stay on the website. I think I was on there for about 8 months, which is quite a record. But it was driving me a bit to frustration with some of the stupidity I was getting on the website. You know, I'll go back to this quickly. I was talking about the apparition at Highgate Cemetery. It has also been seen, it's been experienced in the cemetery where cameras inexplicably stopped working, so do mobile phones. It's been experienced there, and it's actually been witnessed there. One time was in 2006, which was quite recent in terms of time, at least. A man was walking down Swains Lane around midnight. He'd been out in Highgate Village for a drink. And he wasn't drunk. And his name, I can name him because I've already named him in my book. I've named him in my talks. His name was Martin Trent, and he lived near Highgate Cemetery with his wife and very small daughter then. He was walking down the lane, and in the distance he saw something, a black, it seemed like a black shape. It was a cowled figure standing motionless outside the east gate. That's the cemetery opposite the old Highgate Cemetery. And he instinctively, it was quite dark down Swains Lane. It was very badly lit. He instinctively walked right down the middle of the lane. He was a bit worried about it. And as he passed this figure, he didn't look at it. Well, I mean, he could see. He looked at it. So no, it was a shape, and it seemed to be dressed in a sort of black Victorian cloak. As he passed it, he was still in the middle of the road. The figure was on his left. He heard a voice in his ear which simply said, "Good evening, sir." What was frightening about it is, he said it's almost as if the figure had come up to him and whispered, it had rejected its voice. He carried on down the lane, and as he looked back, he lived, I think it was about another 50 or 60 feet on, maybe more than that, down Swains Lane off a road on the right. He looked back up the lane, but because of the camber of the hill, well, I don't want to spill my blood. Because of the camber of the hill, he couldn't actually see its feet. But he could still see the figure. And as he looked in the distance, it seemed to glide from standing outside the gate of the east cemetery back over and disappearing into the gate of the west cemetery. He was pretty shaken up. And other people had reported this figure. Too many people to have been all mistaken. But enough people to convince me that there was some substance in or for these sightings. Another case in Swains Lane. A tall figure had also been reported at the top of Swains Lane. Invariably, usually at night. And as I suspected, it could have had something to do with building work that had been done there. They were building a house right in the lane, but its garden and the actual house was actually in the grounds of Highgate Cemetery.
Is it that modern house? The really
Yes,
sort of super modern square one?
that's the one.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't know what they were doing, Dan, but they had some heavy-duty work going on there, because I walked up to have a look, and they had a cement mixer there. And you don't get a cement mixer if you're just going to, well, put a coat of paint on, do you? The reason I mention that very briefly is that it's another causation, a possible for psychic energy. Because as in the case of some of the other pubs in Highgate, which I had mentioned, but I haven't gone into it, a lot of those pubs, like the Flask and the Gatehouse, especially the Gatehouse, were having renovation work done there. It seemed to coincide with the outbreaks of this psychic activity. And I was very interested in the possibility that psychic energy can actually impregnate itself in stone, but it can replay itself at intervals in the future if the building is disturbed. As I said, not talking about a coat of paint or putting up a shelf, we're talking about heavy-duty renovation work in a house. And reporting on one of these sightings in Swains Lane, heavy renovation work had again been restarted there. But you have to take all these things into account when you are trying to investigate, trying to discover what psychic energy is. And please don't confuse when I said consciousness. That's the thing that gives us all life. Let's not be too quick to confuse consciousness with psychic energy or spirit or ghost. Of course these things probably exist as well. But the key is that they can only exist within consciousness. Ghosts, for example, can only exist in consciousness. If this was not the case, you wouldn't even know ghosts existed. Wouldn't be such things as ghosts. Ben? I'm sorry, Dan.
Yeah.
How's the time?
Yeah, good. I mean, do you want to let the audience fire some questions at you maybe? For
Yeah.
a few minutes, if that's okay?
Of course.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions regarding the Highgate Vampire for David at all? Matteo.
Thanks for the talk, first of all. My question was, you say that you went inside the cemetery to contact the entities. Can you detail for us what was the idea for you to contact Ouija board or channeling or whatever you were planning to do there?
It wasn't channeling. It was to try and find out the nature of this apparition that had been reported in the cemetery by many local people. To find out what it was. I mean, that's my job. It's not really a job, a 9-to-5 job, but I'm the president of the British Psychic and Occult Society, and that's part of the main purpose of the society is to discover the nature of psychic phenomena. That's what we went to Highgate Cemetery for, yeah, on that particular occasion, which was in 1970.
Anyone else have a question for David? Oscar.
Yeah, how all the commotion around the Highgate Vampire, how did this affect your work with the society and your investigations? Was it good or bad fame?
It was bad because other people were cashing in on the society investigations and trying to maintain it was really a blood-sucking vampire. And of course I was approached about this. I was asked about it. And I said it's a load of nonsense. It might be a psychic entity, but it's definitely not a vampire. So it affected me, to answer your question, in that way, because it caused conflict between people who were coming forward and trying to maintain it was a vampire, and people like myself who just trying to find out what it was.
At the back there, sorry, yeah. There you go, fire away.
Not so much a question, it's a statement. Highgate Cemetery now takes tours. You can't go in there unless you're on a tour. And some years ago, quite in recent times, I joined the tour, and some of the people in the group were from America, Canada, who had never heard of the Highgate Vampire. And at the end of the tour, when we were about to disperse, one man, who was American, asked the guide if they ever used actors for effect in the cemetery, because it was mentioned that the place had been used for films, horror films. And they said no, why? And he said, because, he replied, because I saw a figure dressed in black at the gate at the top of the lane as we were coming down. And that was in, I believe, 2011 when I went on this tour. So, just to say that this figure, entity, whatever you want to call it, is probably still active in the area. And it's appearing to people on, this was a tour in the daytime, in the afternoon, so it's probably appearing to all kinds of people at all times of the day and night. So just to say that that was my experience on that tour with that man, who had no idea about it.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. I did hear about that, so I can verify that.
I've got a question. Have you ever had a one-to-one reading with a medium? And if you have you ever had any evidence that you would suggest that there is an afterlife? More positive evidence swinging on the yes than the no?
Well, my mother was involved in spiritualism. She attended 2 spiritualist churches in Highgate, where I was born. And I was brought up into that. She used to attend the churches regularly, and people used to come back to... I was only very young, but I was old enough to remember her bringing back people for coffee after the meetings had finished. And I had long talks with her about certain things, because she was the complete... Rather, my father was the complete opposite to her. He was a businessman. He was a company director. He wanted material advancement in life, yes. He wanted myself to have a good education, yes. But it was all based on material progression. I was not in the least interested. I used to hate school, and my mother knew that. And I just refused to take anything in. I didn't want to, instinctively, don't ask me how, I can't tell you. I know I used to, funny enough, the only subject in one school that I came top of the class in, this is true, was scripture. Because I used to do the essays. I'm writing about the works of Jesus and the works of the prophets and all that in the Testament. And I came top of the class. I've slightly forgotten what I've deviated, I think.
Yeah, I asked if you've ever had a one-to-one reading with a medium and whether you thought they were genuine or not. Was there any evidence?
The answer to that's very simple. Some are, some are not. The majority of mediums you find are, the majority of them are not genuine. It's not that they're fake, it's just that what they think they've summoned up is not really a spirit or an entity. It is a result of a medium picking up, subconsciously, unconsciously, picking up thoughts in the human mind from the person that's come to see her. The medium might believe this is being caused by a spirit, but if she, which is why it works, if you take away her belief in the spirit causing it, it wouldn't work. The answer to that is, I wasn't ignoring it when I started talking about the spiritualist church. I have never, apart from the talks I had with my mother over a period of years, about life, about ghosts, a lot of that originated because the house I was born in was actually haunted. I was born in Highgate. And I did tell my mother about it. Now, whether she actually knew about it or seen it herself, I don't know. But I can tell you that she told me, in trying to explain the nature, that you shouldn't be frightened of these things. They can't harm you. And she also explained to me a lot about dreams, the meaning of actual dreams. I confide in her, and she said, well, this actually means that. It doesn't mean what you think it might think it does. Have I ever, and I presume you're talking about the media outside the usual circle of mediums. The answer to that is no. Not apart from my mother.
Okay, one more? Yeah.
After having spent 50 years or so as studying psychic and occult, what do you find as your beliefs now concerning the afterlife? What do you believe happens after we die?
I so often ask that. And you know, my answer is going to be the same to you, I'm sorry. I don't know. But also, why do people never ask? Or why do they always ask, where do we go? What happens after death? Why do they never say, hang on a minute, where did I come from? Somebody here, we never ask that question. We should, because life must come from somewhere. Something that doesn't exist cannot come into existence. So, in a word, I leave it at that. I see no reason to ask that question. I don't know. And I think the danger is when people start saying they do know, you can usually safely assume they don't know.
I've got one last question for you. Going back to, obviously, vampires. Obviously, you said that the Highgate Vampire isn't a vampire in the true sense of like your Hammer Horror blood-sucking vampire. But would you still agree that the vampire or the apparition that's seen in Highgate Cemetery could be considered a vampire in the way that it could actually feed on people's energy in order to manifest itself?
Yeah, okay then. That's a fair point. And people have often asked me, saying, well, do you believe in psychic vampires? To that I will say there are some human beings, I'm sure we've all encountered them at some point or another, that can have a very negative effect on us. Even people you pass in the street, even people you're meeting at a party in a room. And there are some human beings that can literally drain you of energy, literally give you a headache. You know? It's so oppressive. I'm not denying that, except I don't think the term should be psychic vampires, because again we've got to bring that word vampire into it, and I'm only using the word vampire as an illustration of what I'm trying to explain.
Yeah, that answers pretty much. Yeah. Cool. Is there anyone else with any questions?
David, I have a question. Here, in one magazine, you're known as the Highgate Vampire. Is that right? Because also, I want to know is how did you get involved in all this, and who was the judge that acquitted you? Can you answer?
Well, of course I can.
Thank you.
You talk about the vampire case in 1970. I think his name was DJ Purcell, actually. Unless you're thinking about just the time before that, when the case came to court. It was adjourned once, and the name of the magistrate then was Christopher Lee. That's true. Now, what's that if it's not fate?
Excellent. Well,
yeah.
Is that everything then, David, do you think? Yeah.
Less than any other question. Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay, if you'd like to put your hands together, everyone, for